Hello there, literary thrill seekers, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Old Man Reads Poetry. I'm your host, the aforementioned Old Man, and today I will be celebrating Halloween in my own highly literary way by reading the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. You may be familiar with this one, since it is one of the best-known poems in the English language. It's so well known, in fact, that at least 4 Hollywood movies have been inspired by it and share its name, and 2 of these are squarely in the horror movie genre, although the 1963 Vincent Price version is more of a comedy spoof, to be fair. But with so many of Poe's other works having also been adapted as horror movies, it seems fair to ask whether The Raven is in fact a horror story. I will read it to you, and you can make up your own mind. So, without further ado. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I was scarce sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the darkness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon I heard again a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not an instant stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door. Perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of nevermore." But the raven, still beguiling all my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking "Nevermore." This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl, whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the glass light gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose faint footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. "Wretch," I cried, "thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Prophet," said I, "thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul, with sorrow laden, if, within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend," I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit that bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted nevermore. Well, that's a cheerful little ditty, isn't it? But then, Edgar Allan Poe is seldom accused of being cheerful. You didn't hear it from me, that's for sure. Poe was born in Boston in 1809 and died in Baltimore in 1849. Although this meant he only lived to be 40, he did manage to outlive some of the other young poets of his period, such as Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats, none of whom lived to be older than 36. But more significantly, I think, he also differed from these other poets in that he was among the first to attempt to make a living exclusively from his writing. And although he is considered one of the first American writers to achieve an international reputation, he never achieved real financial success or security. This, in addition to the deaths of many people important to him, made his life difficult and often painful, and this seems to have been reflected in the darkness of many of his works. This includes the poem I have just read you, The Raven, which was his first great popular success and remains probably his best-known work, but which earned him a grand total of only $9, although some sources do say it was a whopping $15. Now, in order to properly understand The Raven, it is necessary to be aware of a couple of facts about actual ravens. First of all, ravens are capable of imitating human speech. When we think of a brightly colored bird sitting atop a pirate's shoulder and squawking, "Hawk, pieces of 8," we are probably picturing a parrot, which is the bird best known for having this ability. But many other species have it also, including ravens, although ravens typically have a much more limited vocabulary than parrots, generally just a few words or simple phrases. This is appropriate for the bird in the poem, which is limited to just a single word, nevermore. Also, in Western European culture, ravens have long been associated with death, no doubt, at least partially, because they feed on carrion, the dead bodies of other animals. This is also appropriate to the bird in the poem, whom the author seems to regard as a sort of messenger from the dead. I first read The Raven many years ago when I was unaware of both these things, and therefore interpreted the poem as being an uncanny story of the supernatural, possibly even an illusion or hallucination. Now that both you and I know more about ravens, however, we can see that this is a perfectly credible tale, even if a highly improbable one, and why the narrator might have been willing to accept the bird as a grim messenger from the beyond. But in order to fully understand the raven, it is necessary to know more than just these few facts about ravens. This poem contains many words which have fallen out of general use, if they were ever really in it, and also contains many classical and biblical allusions which are probably less likely to be understood by today's readers than they would have been in Poe's time. So I will now go through the poem with you and provide you with definitions and background information about things I suspect you might not necessarily recognize immediately. In the first stanza, the narrator is pondering over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Other commentators have suggested that this refers to texts on the occult. Although it is admittedly somewhat speculative, I agree with this and consider it important, for reasons I will explain later. In the second stanza, we learn that the narrator is grieving over the death of his lost love, to whom he gives the pseudonym Lenore, although he explicitly refuses to provide her real name. Nameless here forevermore, he tells us. He is trying to escape from this grief, which is what surcease of sorrow means. As you may be able to infer from the context, the dictionary definition of surcease is end or cessation. By the way, all the definitions I am going to provide you here come from Webster's New World Dictionary, 3rd College edition, which I have here on my bookshelf. There is nothing I consider difficult in the next 4 stanzas, so I will now skip down to stanza 7, which contains a number of items requiring a bit of explanation. In line 3 of this stanza, we have the word obeisance, which is defined as a gesture of respect or reverence. By the way, although I read this word as obeisance, it may also be correctly pronounced as obeisance. In the next line, we have the phrase with mien of lord or lady, which indicates that the raven conducts itself or has the bearing of an aristocrat, that is, an attitude of dignity and perhaps some aloofness. Next, we see the raven perching on a bust of Pallas. Pallas is Pallas Athena, the ancient pagan Greek goddess of wisdom, among other things. That the narrator has such a bust displayed above his chamber door is a clear indication that he considers himself a scholar and a pursuer of knowledge and wisdom. In the next stanza, the narrator addresses the bird, saying, "Thou art sure no craven," meaning no coward. In the next line, we see that our narrator has begun to see the raven as more than a mere simple bird, calling him a ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. What is this nightly shore? It might have been difficult to say for certain, but the next line calls it night's Plutonian shore. Pluto was the Roman version of Hades, god of the underworld. So night is used here as a metaphor for death, and the nightly shore can be understood as the realm of death or the dead. The narrator is thinking of the raven as a traveler between the realms of death and life, and therefore as a possible messenger from the beyond. At the end of this stanza is the first occurrence of the bird speaking the one word he seems to know, nevermore. And at first, the narrator appears to be amused by the raven and his limited vocabulary, which, as he points out, is irrelevant to the question asked. Then, in stanza 10, the bird says, "Nevermore," for the second time. But this time, it seems to the narrator to make sense in the context of the peculiar conversation he is having with the bird, and he calls it reply so aptly spoken. In stanza 11, he goes on to say, "Doubtless what it utters is its only stock and store caught from some unhappy master." This is merely recognizing that if a raven speaks words, it is just imitating something it has heard a human say, presumably someone who is keeping the bird as a pet. It doesn't mean that the bird understands what it is saying or that its utterances have any meaning. But, oddly enough, our scholarly narrator continues to have a sort of conversation with the raven, even though he has already recognized that the bird's responses are entirely predictable. How should we, the readers, interpret this strange conversation? To me, it suggests an attitude of desperation. The narrator is demanding answers to questions which have no answers known to mortal men, and he is willing to seek them both in occult studies and religious faith, two sources which he undoubtedly knows are incompatible, and even in fruitlessly interrogating this mere bird, onto which, in his desperation, he projects knowledge which no bird possesses. This seems strange, but the scholar and seeker of wisdom in him demands answers, even when none are available, even when he himself perhaps understands that no answers are available to him, which only serves to intensify his desperation. In stanzas 12 and 13, he fully commits himself to linking fancy unto fancy, that is, giving himself over to wild and desperate imagining, centering around trying to determine what the raven means by croaking nevermore, which is futile because, of course, the raven means nothing. It is merely repeating a sound it has learned to mimic. Stanza 14 contains several references which may require explanation. If you are a Catholic, you probably know what the censer in the first line is, but if not, let me inform you that a censer is an ornamental container in which incense is burned, often during religious ceremonies. The seraphim, which he imagines to be swinging the censer, are members of the highest order of angels, thus reinforcing the religious connotation of censer. Note that seraphim is plural. The singular is seraph, which is why in the next line he refers to multiple angels. And note that in this line and the next two, he is addressing not the raven, but himself. Not for the first time in the poem, but the only time we see him do so with such intensity of feeling. Respite is an interval of temporary relief or rest, and nepenthe is a drug supposed by the ancient Greeks to cause forgetfulness of sorrow. So, he is admitting to himself that he has the ability to consciously decide to let go of his obsessive, self-pitying grieving over the lost Lenore. He is in fact advising himself to make such a decision, which, in my opinion, would have been an appropriate and healthy one to make. But when the raven again utters nevermore, he seems to interpret this as reinforcing his own unwillingness to make such a decision and drops the idea. In stanza 15, we see that our narrator is no longer as amused by the raven as he initially was. Whereas before the bird was beguiling all my fancy into smiling, the narrator is now becoming impatient with the raven's unsatisfactory repetition of nevermore. He now begins to demand an answer to his two real questions, the first of which he asks here in stanza 15. He states it this way: "Is there balm in Gilead?" Although they might not necessarily have been able to identify this as a reference to verse 22 of the 8th chapter of Jeremiah, most of the audience of Poe's time would have recognized this as a biblical reference to a kind of medicinal substance, used literally for physical healing, but here, and in Jeremiah, used as a metaphor for spiritual healing. In other words, his first question is, will I ever be healed of my sorrow? And then in stanza 16 he asks whether within the distant Aidenn that his soul will be reunited with that of Lenore. Aidenn is a poetical form of Eden, which Poe uses here not as a reference to a long-ago garden, but as a synonym for a future paradise, in other words, heaven. This is a hope many people, even those not deeply religious, hold concerning their deceased loved ones, that the dead are in a quote-unquote better place, and that they will someday have the opportunity to be with their lost loved ones again. And this obviously is the narrator's profoundly desired hope, along with the hope of relief from his present sorrow. But to both his questions, the raven again answers, as both we and the narrator might very well have anticipated, nevermore. This angers the narrator, causing him to jump up out of his chair and shriek, "Get out of here!" Although, of course, he says it in a far more poetical way than I've just done, over the course of almost the entire stanza 17. Interestingly, he doesn't take the raven's mindless remark as necessarily valid, for he calls it that lie thy soul hath spoken. And yet, it clearly makes him furious. What are we to make of this reaction? And indeed, of his entire futile conversation with the raven? To answer this, let me suggest we conduct a little thought experiment. Suppose for a moment we assume that instead of knowing only a single word, the raven has also learned to speak the phrase, "yes, indeed." Then let us further suppose that, by chance, the raven happens to respond to the narrator's questions in stanzas 15 and 16, that is, the questions, "Will I be healed of sorrow?" and "Will I meet Lenore again in some future state of existence?" with this alternative, positive phrase. "Yes," the raven squawks, "you will meet Lenore again, and yes, your sorrow will be healed." Well then, that would have made everything perfectly all right, wouldn't it? Except that, hold on, no it wouldn't. Can we allow ourselves to imagine that this deeply grieving scholar would have been satisfied and had his sorrow lifted merely because he let a random bird which was seeking shelter from a storm into his room, and that bird then by chance uttered some words that had somehow picked up, which seemed to provide an encouraging answer to a question the scholar put to it? Well, I, for one, cannot imagine it, and indeed, it seems to me that it would be crazy to do so. And yet, would that be any more crazy than to allow oneself to be driven to depths of despair by the negative response, "nevermore," from that same random, unreasoning bird? I don't think so. And now, I believe we are in a position to answer the question posed in the title and repeated in the introduction to this video. So, is The Raven a horror story? In my mind, a horror story is one which attempts to give its readers, or hearers, or viewers, depending on the medium in which it is presented, a vicarious thrill by artificially exposing them to something potentially threatening or terrifying, generally using the element of suspense to heighten the shock value. This, The Raven does not do. What it does do is present a vivid and compelling picture of a man's descent into madness, driven by his refusal to let go of his grief and his increasingly desperate attempts to find satisfactory answers to questions which have none. It is, in my opinion, a brilliant psychological study. But since it contains nothing to induce foreboding or fear in its readers, only perhaps a sense of pity for the narrator, it is no horror story. You might be interested, by the way, to know that Poe wrote an essay about his compositional goals and methods called The Philosophy of Composition, in which he uses The Raven as a case study. And although he has much to say there about the effect he hopes to have on his readers, he says nothing about wanting to produce an effect of fear or dread. So, in my mind, case closed. Now, before I let you go, one more thing about this poem. It gives its name to the Baltimore Ravens NFL football team. Although Poe was born in Boston, he lived and worked for part of his life in Baltimore and eventually died there. So the city has laid claim to him. The team even has a live raven mascot named Poe. To the best of my knowledge, no other sports team in the world is named after a poem, or any other literary work for that matter. And I consider this to be a pretty strong indicator of how well-known and popular The Raven remains to this day, which may seem a bit surprising. While it is not the horror story it is sometimes misrepresented to be, it is a story of grief and despair, which hardly seems a likely formula for a popular hit. So, what accounts for its popularity? If you saw my previous video about Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, you may remember that I told you good poets do things with the sound of words to appeal to the emotions through our sense of hearing. And Edgar Allan Poe was as good at this as any poet I have ever read. His use of repeated end rhymes, internal rhymes, alliteration, and other poetical techniques makes The Raven hauntingly beautiful and memorable, grim though the story may be. If any poem was meant to be read aloud, this one certainly was. No doubt for this reason, there are numerous recitations of The Raven available on the internet, many by well-known professional actors. For example, Vincent Price, who has appeared in numerous movies based on works of Poe, naturally has a very entertaining version, which is really more of a performance than a reading. But in my own reading, I have not attempted to compete with nor to imitate anyone else. I have merely tried to give an intelligent and sensitive interpretation based solely on my own understanding of the poem, which is most likely not exactly like anyone else's. If you have enjoyed my reading of it, please give me a thumbs up to show you liked it. Feel free to tell me in the comments section below what you did or did not like about my reading. And if there is another poem you would like to hear me read, please request it. I intend to read many more poems, both the well-known and the more obscure, on this channel. By subscribing, you can be sure not to miss any of my readings, which will be automatically provided to you when they are released. Well, that's all for now. Until next time. Thanks for watching.